Welcome to The Voice of Counseling, presented by the American Counseling Association. This program is hosted by Dr. S. Kent Butler. This week's episode is Neuroscience-Informed Counseling with Children and Adolescents, and features Dr. Ghoston and Dr. Thom Field.
Welcome to The Voice of Counseling from the American Counseling Association. I'm Dr. S. Kent Butler, and joining us today is Drs. Ghoston and Thom Field. Michelle R. Ghoston is an assistant professor at Wake Forest University. She has worked as a counselor educator since 2010 and a licensed counselor since 2006. Dr. Ghoston has worked with a variety of clients in many settings, including group homes, schools, hospitals, private practice, and intensive in-home. Her primary areas of research are social justice and equity, advocacy, and better understanding of how neuroscience influences our work with counselors. Dr. Ghoston currently serves as an editorial board member for the Teaching and Supervision in Counseling Journal, the official SACES journal that's new to the market, and is on multiple task force, including the AMHCA Neuroscience Task Force. Now, let's move on to Thom Field, who is an associate professor at Oregon State University. His research focuses on the integration of neuroscience into counseling, practice, and social justice advocacy. He has published more than 30 peer-reviewed articles and has authored 2 books on the topic of neuroscience integration. He has received grant funding from agencies that include SAMHSA, and in 2019, he received the Counselor Educator of the Year Award for the American Mental Health Counseling Association. He is also a current Standards Revision Committee member for CACREP. He has provided counseling to more than 1,000 clients during his career and currently maintains a small private practice where he serves adolescents and adults. He is a board-certified counselor, a clinical supervisor by the National Board of Certified Counselors and Affiliates. And with that, wow, they're coming gifted, phenomenal neuroscience and integrated into their profession. Doctors Ghoston and Field, how are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for that intro.
Thank you.
I don't know about you, Michelle. I feel better already. I mean,
you feel better already.
Yeah.
Help me understand what was not feeling good for you.
No. Well, I think it feels strange to hear all of the things that you've done in your career by someone you respect so much. Does that make sense?
Oh, well, wow. All right. So I'm glad that you respect.
He's speechless. Oh, wow.
I'm trying to go to. I'm glad that you so respect Dr. Ghoston so much. That's so great. That's what I was trying to get out.
Dr. Butler speechless. Make sure everybody.
I am. You made me speechless. You know, that's one of the hardest things, like you say, to hear yourself being kind of acknowledged in that way, because it's not what you're hoping for, right? You're just wanting to do the work, and so it really kind of comes across as an oddity when you hear it. So you guys caught me off guard for sure. Is that part of what neuroscience is really all about, catching people off guard?
I don't know.
I'm joking.
Yeah, hope not.
So anyway, tell us. Say it again.
Not really, no.
Yeah, I was just joking. So tell us a little bit about the book. You know, it's entitled Neuroscience-Informed Counseling with Children and Adolescents. Tell us about it, and how do you all two find each other? Because it looks like one's on the East Coast and one's on the West Coast.
That's so interesting you mentioned what coast we're on, because I think we both started on the East Coast, then we both went to the West Coast, and we both came back to the East Coast.
And then I went back to the West Coast.
And then he went back. He left me. Wow, this venture, I'm honored, and I say this intro in the book, totally credit to Dr. Field of just the brainchild behind the book itself. And I'll say jokingly, like it was at an ACA conference in Atlanta. We were on the elevator in between presentations or something. And Dr. Field said, yeah, I think I'm going to do this book. And I'm like, well, congratulations. I don't want to write any books. Like, okay, super you, go get her, Thom, go get him. And it wasn't until later that I kind of paused and was like, I think that was a little bit of an invitation. So let me back up. So in that moment, again, just credit to Dr. Field for the invitation. But our connection goes way back to our master's program. And Dr. Field, I'll let you fill in just kind of the research work side of that. But all the way back to our master's program, we share a common mentor that still impacts our lives today, which the book is dedicated to. So that's kind of that peripheral, how things got started.
So, yeah. What say ye?
What's that?
I would say, what say ye, Thom?
Dr.
Field, tell me a little bit.
Well, I think I follow Michelle. Michelle was earlier in our master's program than I was, and I was maybe a couple years behind you. And we had the same mentor. And I think just because we were both very close with our mentor, and the mentor kind of connected us. We didn't actually know each other in program, but when we were both in our doctoral studies, we started to kind of know about each other and follow each other's work. And
nice.
Then we started doing things like presenting with each other at conferences. We presented at ACA a couple years straight on, I think it was autism, working with kids with autism. And then just, I continued since then. I still walk in the shadow of the great esteemed Dr. Michelle Ghoston.
Not true. Not true.
So you all definitely have a very positive and strong relationship. What was it like to collaborate together and to write together? How did you push one another or challenge one another or work well with one another to get this product done?
Woo.
That's a good question. What's funny? This book was also written in a very short time frame. I think we had a summer to do it. Oh, wow. And so we kind of had talked about it and had put all the ideas together, and it was like, well, we're going to have to write the book now. And so we talked a lot that summer, kind of back and forth. We would send each other drafts, and Michelle and I would kind of pick apart which chapters do you want to write versus me, and who's taking lead on what. And I kind of enjoyed it. I actually had broken my ankle that summer. Do you remember that, Michelle? And so I was laid up writing for most of the summer.
And I was trying to enjoy sunny California, and you kept disturbing me.
It's true. It's true.
Mm-hmm. So this is really great to see the inner workings of this book. So you guys are going back and forth. That's a great relationship.
I think that was, again, I never thought of writing a book. Like, it has never been on my list of things to do. And I don't know if I could have done it with anyone else other than Thom in this space, just because I think our connection, our work history, intensive with children, group homes, hospitals, in the same community. So we knew the same systems, we knew the same psychiatrists and counselors from that end. But then on a professional end, I think when you work with people, you have to be able to hear, push back, hear some more, and then adjust. Like, you got to be able to have that type of interaction or relationship. And I think Thom and I have that, so that, maybe someone else, I might not would have said like, oh, I think we should do this. This makes more sense. Right. And feel like, okay, he might still reject it. Doesn't mean he's going to hear, something's going to change, but I think he'll pause and hear that. And I think with an undertaking, as mentioned, in such a small amount of time, you've got to have some of that. So, yeah.
I think that's right, Michelle. Because I don't think we had a lot of conflict about what goes in the chapters or whatever, but when we did have things that we would kind of go back and forth with each other about, I think we have the kind of relationship where it's just very easy and natural for us to do that, and for you to say, you need to be writing less in this chapter, Thom, right? Or actually, I want to take this chapter in this direction. What do you think? And, I think it was pretty easy for us to do that, just based on the rapport we already had. And I think also the respect in each other's work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you could, what would be elevator conversation someone would have, 2-minute talk on what neuroscience is?
It's a big question.
So you go for 2 minutes, Thom.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'll go for 5 minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
All right.
No. Do you want to take a shot at first? You want me to
try? Go ahead.
Neuroscience. So the question is, what is neuroscience, not neuroscience-informed counseling, which to me is
we're going to get there.
We'll get there.
Okay. Some context, because I don't know that everybody follows what neuroscience is. So I want to get some context real quick.
And I appreciate that, because I think that's one thing that holds people back from the neuroscience education part. Go ahead, Dr. Field.
I think, to put it in a 2-minute spiel, neuroscience is our attempts at understanding a person's basic biology. And that includes everything from the way that the brain functions, different regions of the brain, different structures of the brain, different parts of the central nervous system that include spinal cord, and then also parts of the peripheral nervous system. So, for example, you're interested in muscle group sensation. And there are a lot of different types. There's like a lot of subdomains of neuroscience, right? You have everything from affective neuroscience, right, to more cognitive neuroscience. And those are things that counselors generally don't get involved in too much. We're not trained as neuroscientists. I think the general idea or principle is that neuroscience is trying to understand what's happening with a person's biology. And I will also add, and this is an important piece to be talking to counselors about, how all of those things are interrelated, right? All of the different structures of the brain, how they interrelate with each other, how the brain, and for example, spinal cord, different parts of the periphery, how they talk to each other. I think that one of the things that we really have grown a lot in our understanding of is how interconnected things are, rather than isolating something and just looking at that without context of other things. So, for example, we talk about structures such as the amygdala a lot in counseling. The amygdala is important, but you also have to understand how the amygdala works in relationship to other structures in the brain, right? Such as the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, for example, even the prefrontal areas. And so I think that's maybe the other piece to add about neuroscience, is that over time, there's been much more of a focus on not just isolating regions, but also how it all interconnects. That's important to our work because if we just focus on these isolated things in the brain, we kind of miss the point, which is that the brain works, the body works in a way to help us with a series of things that we encounter in our daily lives. And if we just look at it in those pieces in isolation, we don't really understand how one piece affects another and the relationship between them. And that you've talked, at length in our profession about how the brain and body tend to be kind of disengaged. We don't tend to think about how a person can, how a person's physiological functioning is influenced by brain and vice versa. It tends to be, the mind and body kind of split that came from Cartesian dualism with René Descartes back in the day. And so that kind of division of brain and body, I think, is getting addressed in larger neuroscience as well as being better understood in the counseling profession. This idea that the way that our body responds to the brain and vice versa is important. And we can't just look at anything in isolation.
Well, and I think I'm sorry, Dr. Butler.
No, I was saying that provides a really good context. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and with that being, again, it's a study in and of itself. When you think of the biology and the makeup and how things connect or disconnect, now making that user friendly so that the client, i.e. a 5-year-old or a 17-year-old, and then we bring in a parent, a foster parent, a grandparent, and say, we're going to teach you the biology of the brain. No, so the counselor gets a concept of how the brain works that then impacts the client. So that when my client is, just to use biting, because that may come up, when my client is biting, yes, that's a behavior, and there's something that led to that, we want to be able to see a bigger picture, right? And so that also gives us as counselors a way to see the whole person versus just saying that kid always gets in trouble and they're always biting people. It's a bad kid, which we never want to say. Yeah. It's a bad person. No, there are things happening biologically in the mind, in the brain, the makeup that's leading to some of that behavior. That's
wonderful. So that gives us an opportunity to go into a question about this in regards to counselors. I think this has been very helpful. So how can counselors in various settings enhance their work with clients through the implementation of neuroscience-informed approaches, such as when they're working with families in schools or in the hospitals? What are some examples that you might be able to share?
Mm-hmm. I think as we think of that, we thought about like how dividing that to like early childhood and adolescence. And so we'll maybe divide it that way and give you some pointers on that.
Okay.
I think I was taking the child part, right? And you were taking the adolescent part. Yep.
You got it.
So a couple of things to kind of give examples of, about how counselors can be aware of these pieces and maybe provide information or education to families about these pieces. And then we'll talk more about how this impacts counseling in a minute, like the actual, provision of counseling. So here's a couple of examples. We know now the impacts of stress, both chronic and traumatic stress on a person, and what the impacts are during childhood. And, we've had a lot of studies come out about adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs. Things like bullying, I would maybe add to ACEs. Those things over time are known to impact things like child reactivity, right? The degree to which a child becomes aggressive or emotional in response to maybe situational antecedents that you wouldn't typically expect them to become as upset about. It also is a risk factor for obesity and other health concerns, and can lead to things like accelerated pubertal maturation, right? So we have an understanding of the role of stress, and I think counselors can definitely take that on and use that with clients who they know are living in a high stress kind of situation, and work with families, work with also social structures to address some of those stressors. A systems approach, I think, is often needed there. Same thing with bonding and attachment, which is very important to early childhood. What we know is that, believe it or not, the oxytocin hormone, right, that is released during bonding experiences, particularly physical touch, by the way, is an important part of re-regulation from stress response. If you think about a young child, let's say a young child stubs their toe or something, they'll run up to a caregiver and they'll want to be held. Now, why do they want to be held? Well, interestingly enough, there are oxytocin receptor genes in the amygdala, and there's a general thought that bonding assuages things like fear, right? Things like high emotional response. And so we are interpersonally regulated, and counselors have an understanding of that when working with families, also working directly with clients, right? How can they hold someone in a session, maybe without doing so physically, in a way that helps a person re-regulate? In addition, I would also add, during early childhood, you do see changes with things like synaptic pruning occurring. And we know that synaptic pruning is associated with high irritability. And so you've probably heard of the three-nager, right? A 3-year-old child who is quite irritable and crabby. And part of that is all of the changes that are occurring in the brain. In general, when a kind of abrupt change occurs in the brain, we don't love that. The neurons don't love abrupt change. Okay. And so when you have all these synapses being pruned, you could imagine that it would lead to things like irritability. And it, again, helps a family understand that no, their child isn't, abnormally aggressive or whatever, or abnormally upset. It's just part of their typical development.
Well, let me ask you a quick question. Is that culturally inspired?
This idea of pruning, is that right?
Yeah, but I'm listening to what you're saying, and I know that, there are different ways that children are responded to.
Yes.
And I'm thinking specifically about African-American children.
Yes.
Who are, when you say what you just shared, it took me to that space. And I'm wondering, is that something that we need to really be expressing to counselors and to teachers and others, caregivers, of course, but about how they interact with children, if that is indeed something that could affect how they kind of see themselves or participate in the world?
You're absolutely right, Kent, that let's just take the concept of aggression, right? That is perceived very differently of a person from a different racial ethnic background. And that is definitely something that we can intervene as counselors with and explain that, if a child is aggressive, it doesn't necessarily mean very much. And we shouldn't interpret that through the lens of, these kind of stereotypes of right. A person being from a certain background, being more aggressive, or, I think all children are irritable during synaptic pruning, but you're right that can be interpreted differently based on stereotypes and social bias.
And I can imagine that carries on, because as you just said that, even I'm thinking about what happened a couple of weeks ago with the young man in the mall who was handcuffed because of aggressive behavior, and the thinking that law enforcement might have when they come across someone who is essentially trying to, live their life based on certain things, but, you have somebody who's seeing them as aggressive or whatever have you, but
well, wow. I think that drifts then into kind of how we see the imbalance the imbalance model with adolescents, because as soon as you say adolescents, I think resistant person, I think impulsive, right? And we see that, and then that can also be a cultural lens, right? African Americans are louder, or like you can put all that into it. At the same time, recognizing that in all adolescents, right, there's part of the limbic system that goes really fast. And so we look at this being and think they should be able to, when in actuality, in that adolescent stage, the prefrontal part takes into our 20s.
Right.
It doesn't really matter if I'm Afrocentric, European, Asian, right? But society tells us no, because you look this way, right? You have, your brain looks to be quote unquote normal sized. You should be able to. And then we find with adolescents, they are impulsive. They are sometimes reckless. They're not able to emotionally settle the idea of emotional regulation, foreign concept, right? And as they get into, again, their 20s and sometimes mid-20s, depending, right? You see some of that take shape. And a great example of that is ending of a relationship, right? And we can say a partner situation or just a best friend, right? It doesn't even have to be quote unquote what we call my partner or significant other, but a best friend, right? So we fall out, or we don't, like we're not best friends anymore. You're not my best friend anymore. And in this world of social media, as a adolescent, I want to smear their name. I want to post on social media personal things. I want to, right? That's my impulse.
My attack, right?
My attack. But deep down, I really, like, God, I miss my friend. I kind of want us to reconcile.
Right.
But in the moment, I think of what I'm going to get, that a release of.
Right.
I got them back.
Right.
Only
and even
later.
and even if it doesn't play out that way, just the mere act helps you kind of reconcile that within yourself, right?
Yes. And again, unless there's an adult or someone to intervene and to understand. And the last thing I'll share is, like, when I remember working at the group home, and probably one of the biggest kind of pat on the backs I got from a boss as I was leaving, it's like, you're the biggest advocate for these kids who often schools, administrators don't give a second chance. And so I never overlooked the behavior of stealing the car, like that. There are consequences for that.
Right.
But I know, and even know more now from understanding the neuroscience part of things, that development wasn't there. So I'm not excusing the behavior. But let's look at, it was a thrill, right? Get the keys, get the car, go.
Right.
They weren't able to stop and say accident, illegal, those types of things.
So you said something earlier that I want to go back to that made me think of this, right? So the question I have for you is this: is it learned or is it developmental?
See, I'm going to do a student response when students ask questions like that. I'm going to say both and, right? Like it's both and. And so this may be stepping away from our conversation a little bit, but some of it is the biology, the makeup, that we have to go through these developmental stages. And we're talking about, I hate using the word normal, also development, right? No, we're not talking about someone who has some cognitive delays, some significant complex traumas. those things matter. We cannot dismiss that. And that's why I think looking at certain models makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. And I do learn from those around me what thus counseling. I believe that they can be unlearned, or I can train and support clients, children, adolescents, parents, whomever, to unlearn or have a new perspective on things and see it different. So that's my quick response. And I know time is running, but so Thom, any thoughts from you?
I think as with all things, it's complex, and you can't reduce something, right, to something that's very straightforward. I think that let's use we've talked about the word aggression. There's all kinds of reasons why a person could be aggressive, right, or could be perceived, to Kent's point about being aggressive, and and then there are different perceptions on what that aggression means, right? So, I mean, you've heard about, for example, these situations where a college student who's white male, their aggression, particularly things like sexually related aggression, gets dismissed or isn't really taken very seriously, whereas all kinds of horrific stories about shooting, especially black men, right, young black men who are running through neighborhoods, right? You think of Ahmaud Arbery, and so I think the interpretation matters as well as how these behaviors kind of manifest, right? And some of it is developmental, right? If you look at the adolescent brain, adolescents are more risk-taking, right? The dopaminergic system increases 2 to 7 times during adolescence, right? And so that's definitely there. At the same time, not all adolescents are aggressive, and there are definitely environmental pieces to that. But also the perception of that, I think, to your point, Kent, is something we really should be attending to as counselors. How are people in a person's community being seen? And to give you a very quick story about that, I have a consultee who specializes in black mental health, and they had a student they were kind of consulting with about recently, who did get expelled from school, and the student wasn't doing anything that seemed really outside of the realm of adolescent behavior. They were doing things like blocking another student from entering the school building to tease them, right? And that was perceived as aggression, and they were dismissed from school. And so I think as counselors, when you hear that, you have a role in advocating and talking to the school, right, and talking to the community.
Right. It's really interesting when you say something like that. It brings me back to like when you're teaching and students are like, well, this person seems really aggressive, right? Or this person was intimidating, or how they, and I was like, so tell me a little bit about that. And, so what they're perceiving or what they see is this person just really being expressive, right? And in the Black community, that is a big thing, being really expressive, right? And so when somebody has passion behind something, they may talk louder, they may talk faster, they may, be really demonstrative in terms of how they share their story. And then people are taken aback by that. They're like, wait a minute, you're the angry Black person. You're this, you're that. And the truth of the matter is that's not true. It's just that somebody is engaged in that conversation in that way. So the question I typically ask someone is, have you gone into those communities and actually watched? Did you just sit and do an ethnography on that particular community, right? And so, because if you sat and watched someone play a spades game in the Black community, or gone to a church service and seen them express themselves in church, then you would see that behavior as normalized.
Yes.
Yeah.
And not as one of aggression or this or that. And because you're coming from an environment that doesn't necessarily participate in those types of interactions or in that manner, if that makes sense.
Well, and you said passion, right, versus aggression, right? And you can hear that when people describe certain, you can almost tell, if culturally speaking, how someone identifies by how the person explains them to you. Right. Yeah. This kid was in school and he was so passionate about going after that ball. He was just all over the place. Right. Versus, that kid was in school and he was so angry and aggressive going after that ball. Like, they don't even have to say ethnic appearance or phenotype. From that explanation, that must have been typically a Black kid, or at least a minoritized kid, versus, oh, this is probably a white kid or white appearing kid, like how they say passion versus anger or aggression.
Right. And that words matter.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Absolutely.
So listen, we're coming up on a time for us to take a quick break, but I'm really enjoying this. And when we come back, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the book. You all have 3 primary principles, and I think that's where I want to start off with, and to talk about what those are with regards to that. So this has been The Voice of Counseling. I'm Dr. S. Kent Butler. I'm here with Dr. Ghoston and Dr. Field, and we'll be back in a moment.
Counselors help positively impact lives by providing support, wellness, treatment. We're working to change lives. We are creating a world where every person has access to the quality, professional counseling, and mental health services needed to thrive.
Welcome back to The Voice of Counseling. I'm here today with Dr. Ghoston, Michelle Ghoston, and Dr. Thom Field. And I want to ask Thom a quick question. Does neuroscience, especially neuroscience-informed counseling, get a bad rap?
I think it certainly can. And part of what I've really enjoyed in the conversation so far is that neuroscience can be perceived as reductionist, all right? As you're just boiling a person down to their biology, and then you're making these way overgeneralized statements about behavior, right, related to genetics or how a person kind of biology works. And I think there's so much, I think it's a component. You think about the biopsychosocial model as an example of this. It's one component. And we've talked about things like bias, social bias, discrimination, experiences that people have, the way that we can perceive a person's behavior very differently. I think those are all really important and often intersect with, relate with neuroscience. And so my hope would be that people see it as a component of their work rather than as reductionist and overly explaining different kind of social experiences that people have that are related to neuroscience and can interact with it.
I think that for me, when you say, oh, I'm interested in neuroscience or my book is in relation to neuroscience, I think there's a fear of, I didn't like biology in school, so why would I try to implement, like, I think that's the resistance of like, okay, now I've got to go learn something that, not understanding the connection that it can have. And it's interesting because I think when there's something medical that's kind of associated with the brain, we get it. Yeah. We like, okay, that's a medical diagnosis that explains it. But then when we say behaviors or affect or engagement with the eyes or, those kinds of things, we pause and say, well, no, I'm not sure if that's, so I think it's a fear because it feels like a heavy topic.
The word itself is daunting, right?
Yes.
Neuroscience. Yeah. And, and the first thing a person might think is, oh, that's just a nerd counselor.
Yeah.
Right? And so your book, Neuroscience-Informed Counseling in Children and Adolescents, you talk about 3 primary principles of working with children and adolescents. Can you talk about that? And how does a counselor integrate that into their work?
Yeah, and see, this is where I think hopefully it breaks it down, that it's nothing that's out of this world, nerdy or even scientific. Those 3 things, and I'll expand on them, but those 3 things very specifically is, number 1, seek not to label. I mean, that I feel like we've been doing better with that. Like there is the DSM, but we're trying to use it for its purposes, but not to label. Number 1.
Not to label.
Not to label.
Okay.
Number 2, the therapeutic relationship still matters. The research says, I don't care what approach we bring, what style, however, we can be Rogerian, we can be CBT, but if there's no relationship, the client probably won't even come back. So so you gotta
build rapport,
seek to develop a good relationship.
Nice.
And then 3rd, we then got to check ourselves, personal and professional development, growth, awareness, competencies, right? We can list that out. All right. So
I like that.
3 basic things, right?
Yes.
And I think as we think about those cultural interactions and those pieces, like I currently see 6 to 10 clients a week, and Tuesdays is my kids' day. Like I see them in person, right? Yeah. And so I have as young as 7. My oldest adolescent is 16, right? So there's some days where, and at this point in my career, I'm seeing kids, quote unquote, from the middle class to upper class. Whereas my earlier years, I saw group home, inner city, right?
Right.
Let me just tell you now, they all have the same struggles.
They all have the same struggles.
Right.
Don't try to classify them differently.
You can't. So I could go in with my own lens of an Afrocentric woman. You got to follow these rules, right? Because I know how my mom raised me, and you have to do this.
Right.
That's a mess up for so many reasons.
Okay.
Culturally speaking, I'm older, a different generation, right? Technology wasn't a main issue in my home.
True.
Right. And so I have to make those adjustments.
Okay.
I have a family that's from Brazil, and the kid comes in sometimes and she teaches me Portuguese. Like, well, that really doesn't have much to do with the fact that she's, shutting down at school, so I've got to relax and build relationship.
She's making a connection.
So we've been working together for a year. She now comes in, she takes off her shoes, she lays in the floor. And she says to me almost every week, I just feel so comfortable here. Right? That has nothing to do with neuroscience. That has, right? The idea of these 3 things, I can't get to helping she and mom and dad and older brother until they can trust and build a relationship.
Nice.
Right? And I can't just look at the DSM. Yes, she has some issues with emotions. She's not able to regulate her emotions, but she's also a culturally different kid who the teacher chose to set at the back of the class with a mask on.
Wow.
Right? So as we think about the neuroscience part of it, yes, I know her makeup. I know where she is developmentally, but I've got to be able to follow these 3 principles in order to then begin to say, okay, how can I now help mom see and understand the developmental pieces?
Wow. Yeah. That's great. That's absolutely wonderful. And I think that it also gives that person dimension, right? You see them from multiple arenas as opposed to just that one-dimensional way that they came in with this issue. And so that's what it is. Thom, are there symptoms that counselors should be looking out for that children and adolescents might kind of display? Is there something?
Symptoms. I mean, certainly. I mean, related to neuroscience.
Let me pull it back. So somebody who comes in, you talked about autism earlier.
Yeah.
Somebody who might have Tourette's or something along those lines. Are those things that neuroscience and informed counseling support and help when you're working with a child?
That's a good question. So I want to begin by saying that neuroscience knowledge is not just diagnostic knowledge. My fear is that a lot of clinicians, counselors will come into this book and imagine this is going to explain all the things I need to know in terms of a person's diagnosis. And that's primarily what I need to know neuroscience for. And I think, Michelle went through those 3 principles. Part of the reason those 3 principles are so important is without those 3 principles, a person may be labeling with a person, right? They will use neuroscience for labeling purposes. They may not form an effective working relationship and use neuroscience in a way that feels overly prescriptive or overly explanatory, and that doesn't give a person space to process their own experience. And they may also not be aware of the areas of gaps they have in their own knowledge, right? As counselors.
But if a child comes to you and they've already been diagnosed with that's what I'm talking about. Not you necessarily going to the DSM and then making this diagnosis on this child. Is there techniques or interventions or things along those lines in the counseling experience that could support children who are experiencing those types of?
Oh, sure, yes. I mean, So you mentioned, for example, tic disorders, Tourette's being one of them. Let's start with tic disorders. Tic disorders, there are things to do in counseling that are important as a kind of like in parallel to other forms of medical treatment. So for example, having worked with kids with tic disorders before, kids with tic disorders have a lot of embarrassment about it and how it shows up in school. And being able to give them space to talk about that and talk about, how they talk to others about it and what they do when they feel embarrassed and what's a safe thing for them to kind of do to process that embarrassment. Those are places where counselors can be very helpful. Okay. Can counselors stop a tic disorder? Not really. No. I mean, that's not what we do. But the experience of it, the experience of having the tic disorder, that's a place where counselors can definitely help.
And you mentioned this at the very beginning, Thom, the stress related to it.
Right.
My niece used to just like her hair, she would just pick her hair, and it was when she was stressed and anxious.
Right.
And she never went to a counselor. She came to counselor Michelle Auntie, but I couldn't stop it. Right. But I could help her connect back to when she's feeling anxious, when she's feeling stressed. And
so how do you help someone who's 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old? How do you help them recognize that they're even having stress? Because you can ask that question day in and day night, right? And day in and day out. I don't know what day in and day night is, but day in and day out, you can ask that question, but they will not be able to really be able to kind of share, because that's developmental, right? What is actually happening to them within their body system.
There are two main cases in the book. One's a child case and one's an adolescent case. Mm-hmm. And we talk about different interventions. There's different chapters on, for example, one on play therapy, to kind of follow up with what Michelle was sharing. Mm-hmm. And those approaches are applied to these two major cases, one a child case, one an adolescent case. Mm-hmm. The case that I'll talk to you about is the child case. The child's name is Wayne. It's not their actual name. We changed a lot of identifiers. They're 8 years old in the case study. They're a white male receiving special education services between IQ 55 and 65, tested IQ. They were referred by their school counselor after having multiple incidents of attacking teachers and students, both verbally and physically, with a recent incident whereby they bit a child's ear and caused a partial tear. Michelle had mentioned that earlier on. And the antecedent was the teacher had prompted a math task completion instead of drawing video game characters, which Wayne did not respond well to. And so part of the crisis in this case is what does the school do in response to this child? Wayne is calm and aloof at home, seems to not particularly be bonded to caregivers, has no chores, completes homework before coming home, otherwise he'd apparently never do it. Wayne was adopted at the age of 2 and is rarely taken into public by the parents because he apparently destroys items if he doesn't receive what he wants in the store or restaurant immediately. In fact, it's to the point where whenever they go out, Wayne demands to visit 2 fast food restaurants and wants very specific food there, even though he only eats one of those meals. And the parents still go to each restaurant because they're terrified of how he'll respond in the car. In the past, he's grabbed the steering wheel and has unbuckled his seatbelt. And so there's some concerns about safety with taking him out into the community.
So how would a counselor support that and help the parent in those situations?
A couple of different ways. I think first, you have to work with the school system, right, to help them understand what's going on, see if there are additional supports that can be provided, right? Maybe the student will respond really well if they have someone like, for example, a behavior specialist or, a day treatment kind of counselor in the school. I think there's also a need for family involvement, family therapy, maybe in-home therapy, for the family to be supported in setting limits with the child, knowing that there are definitely, I would say, security risks there. Like you don't want, for example, to put a child in a car and only go into one restaurant if they're going out without things like harnesses or some kind of special equipment to help a person not be able to unbuckle. And maybe you do some of those things in the home environment first before going out into a more dangerous kind of situation. I think those things matter. And the family needs to attend to what is motivating to this person as part of the intervention. So a behavioral type of intervention would make sense here rather than play therapy. Because the behaviors are so problematic. It's not like processing of an experience that needs to happen necessarily. It's more just how do we help this person reduce aggression. And so I think you would look at reinforcement history. For example, it occurs to me that maybe there's negative reinforcement happening here, whereby Wayne is attacking other children to avoid the task of work, right? And so the removal of the work task is the reinforcement. And so how do you work on that as in school situations or also in home situations? Those are the types of things you'd be working on.
Excellent. So we're coming up on this time has moved really quickly, but Michelle, I'm going to ask you really quickly. I'm intrigued by the term neuroeducation, and so can you talk a little bit about how a counselor can serve helping adolescents? Maybe you can tie that a little bit together with their identity development. Is there a connection there? And if so, can you kind of quickly share that in our time?
When we think of identity development, we know for adolescents, they're going through a huge period of change, who I am, how I express myself. And that includes my identity as if I identify one way or the other, my attraction to someone, how I feel, is it love that I feel in my heart versus how I feel with an intimate partner, love, and all that matters in the development of an adolescent. I think when we figure out how counselors create this educational model, in my immediate thought is recognition, acknowledge this is happening. And we can't just do a certain age. I have a 10-year-old who's already exploring things on the internet, right? So much so that they're getting in trouble at school, right? They're curious, right? And so we have to validate this is happening. We can't dismiss it. We have to assess what's happening. Is it something behavioral intervention, that process? And then we got to deliver information that they can receive. We're not going to get into deep biology. We're going to give it to them where parents can receive it and the child can know, I'm not a bad kid. I'm curious. I'm curious what the opposite sex looks like. And so, again, those 3 basic steps is also in the book of just how to deliver time.
Oh, I love it. And so we might just have to leave it there. We can't do neuroscience in 30 minutes. Can't do it in 50 minutes.
We might need a part 2.
You might get a part 2. We might have to do a part 2. But definitely intrigued by what you all have been able to share today. Can you maybe in 20 seconds give us a synopsis of what we need to know moving forward before we get to the part 2?
Go ahead, Thom.
20 seconds. I think neuroscience can fit into your counseling practice if you approach it from a position of integration, that the other stuff still matters. The relationship still matters. That look at social factors, things like bias, discrimination, that still matters. Excellent. Right? That it all plays into how we can best help a person and understand them.
Excellent. So listen, all you out there listening in, I need you to go get this book. I need you to go get this book, right? And it will help you as you're working with these young people. So it is Neuroscience-Informed Counseling with Children and Adolescents. Thank you, Dr. Michelle Ghoston. Thank you, Dr. Thom Field, for your phenomenal insight. This has been The Voice of Counseling, and we'll talk to you next time.
ACA provides these podcasts solely for informational and educational purposes. Opinions expressed in these podcasts do not necessarily reflect the view of ACA. ACA is not responsible for the consequences of any decisions or actions taken in reliance upon or as a result of the information and resources provided in this program. This program is copyright 2022 by the American Counseling Association. All rights reserved.